It's Morning Talk on News Talk 1250 KBRF, brought to you by Pioneer Care and Fergus Falls Monument Company. Now, here's Mary Dolan and Dave Bishop.
Good morning. On a Monday morning, January 20th, we have a special show for you today. This is our tribute to Gary Spies, who will be laid to rest later today, and he was just such an extraordinary man in Fergus Falls for so many reasons that we decided it was, I think it's appropriate to give him the show today, and the Spies family all around. So we've got a number of guests to visit with us about their connection to Gary, and we've already heard some really great stories, some that make us laugh out loud and some that make us think, yep, that was Gary. And you're going to hear a lot of that today. John MacFarlane is with us. Mark Helland, Ben Schierer, and Carrie Brimhall are all with us today to talk about their connection to Gary and how he affected them, maybe their positions at work. Certainly anyone who knew him, he affected personally as well. So good to have you all with us. Thank you for taking time out today. Just want to remind you that visitation is at First Lutheran Church today from 10 until 1. The service begins at 1 p.m., and if you cannot make it, there will be a live stream of the service, and you just need to go to the Olson Funeral Home website and click on that link, and you'll be able to watch it from home. So everyone can be involved today. Ben, I'm going to start with you and your connection to Gary. I know, again, so many connections over so many years. It's hard to decide what to say, and hopefully we've given you enough time to give it some thought. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, absolutely, Mary. Thanks for having us in here this morning to talk about someone who's so important to our community in so many different ways and to us as individuals. I think when I think back on Gary's life and the way that he touched my life, I think about all the things in the community that he did, and we'll talk about those things, the different ways that he touched the community. But I think about the people that he made better in this community, the people he supported in so many ways that went unseen. And I think about his generosity and his compassion. And I think that, one thing I think it was mentioned in the obituary, Gary had this little story he'd like to tell, that when the good Lord was putting blessings on the world, the cap of the sugar shaker fell off when he was going over him. And I think that that's important to me because Gary was incredibly successful. He's a smart businessman. He was very, very, very smart, incredibly successful, but he understood that he was successful because of other people, and he wanted to share that success with others. And so to me, just the way that again, whether it's the college or the community arena or the library or the cancer center, so many ways that are very prominent in our community that he influenced. But it's all the people that he touched and all the lives behind the scenes, just hundreds of ways that he would help people every day and made this community better. So he'll be greatly missed in so many ways. But I think for a community, it's hard to replace that behind the scenes generosity and support that he showed to so many people and just made them better people.
Yeah, I think so too. And there are so many people that are hopefully sitting listening today who are nodding along with you and saying, yep, that he affected me in this way or that way. And we'll just keep going around the table. And Carrie, maybe you can give us a little bit of, perspective on your connection to Gary.
Absolutely. Well, it starts as a professional connection to the college. I said in my Facebook post, and many of us have heard him say so many times, there are 3 rocks in this community: the college, Otter Tail Power, and the hospital. And we need to make sure all 3 of them are strong. So I certainly knew of Gary, knew of his generous and compassionate leadership in our community. But early in my career, when I wasn't sure I wanted to be at the college forever and ever, and I was experiencing a little bit of what do I do with my life in Fergus Falls, I met with Gary at Perkins, and he was very clear to me that he expected me to stay at the college because of this rock. And he just said, I will pray that everything continues to work out for you, but we need you there. The college and the community needs you they need you to lead. And that was before I was a leader, certainly before I was a president. And the next day he showed up at my office with a sign that said, never, never, never give up. And I think several of us have gotten that sign in a moment of being unclear about our future. And from that moment on, he really took it upon himself to check on me, just like he checked on so many people in our community, and just continue to encourage and support me as a leader and as a person in this community. And I'll never forget that generous act, and also that drawing the line in the sand. I can see ahead, and we need you, and we need you to step into that role. And he was instrumental in supporting me throughout my entire career, and also supporting the college, our students, and just what we bring to the community, but never asked for anything in return. And I think as a leader, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from Gary is that, sometimes things would come out like, so-and-so's sister's, aunt's, brother's kid needs a furnace. And so I'm going to do that today. But it was really not... that was not how he led in this community. It was behind the scenes, as Ben said, and it was never for glory. It was always for good. And I think that as a leader of an organization and in this community, just the lessons I've learned from sitting back, helping without trying to get anything in return are really something that's lifelong impact for me.
That's a hard thing too sometimes, because you sort of when you're giving it, you kind of want people to know that you're giving, and you I think it's just in all of us to sort of want that credit, and somehow that bypassed Gary because he never wanted that credit. And how interesting that he came to you, Carrie, an individual, and said, "Okay, I know you're a little shaky on this job thing. I'm kind of going to tell you what to do." And wouldn't that be nice? Man, I wish I'd called Gary a couple of times and said, "What do you think about this?" But and certainly you weren't the only person he came to give advice to. And it's fun to hear those stories. Well, around the horn we go. John MacFarlane is the next. And John, you knew Gary in so many different ways, and I know he is a very, very dear friend.
Yes, we were, and I was just thinking about how I met him. It was probably in 1978, and we just moved to town, and I was sitting in my office, and the phone rang, and it was Gary, and I kind of knew who he was. And he wanted to take me out to lunch. He wanted to get to know me a little better, he said. And the other thing that was happening about this time was Otter Tail Power had a pretty good-sized rate increase, and so we were kind of ducking for cover. And I thought, here's a big customer. And but we went out to the Holiday Inn, had a nice lunch. He talked about his family, I talked about mine. We got to know one another. He talked, said all these complimentary things about Otter Tail, and he talked a great deal about Fergus Falls, explaining what kind of a community it was and how things worked here. And I was just waiting for this shoe to drop. It never did.
Never did.
And so he picked up the check, of course, and dropped me off back at Otter Tail, and I thought, boy, now there's an uncommon man. And he was. There was no question about that. And I've had the good fortune of being part of his Tuesday morning breakfast group, and that started probably in the late 90s, so it's 25 plus years. And he would kind of report what he was up to, and we'd hear about a lot of things that he was doing, and we knew it, and helping people, and it was just marvelous. I thought what he was doing. I had him on the Otter Tail board, and there was there was 9 people on there, and a lot of them got pretty good pedigrees. They got a lot of initials around their names, and Gary didn't have so many. But sometimes we'd have issues, just like there is in any meeting, and everybody thinks everybody else needs the benefit of their thinking, and they kind of all want to talk at the same time, and you kind of can't keep control. But the only time there was a hush in the room was when Gary spoke, because everybody wanted to hear what Gary was going to have to say, and it happened time and again. It was just amazing, and often as not, that's the way we went, because he just had that wisdom, the business sense, and whatever else it was. I suppose the other people, the finance people, were coming from their end, and the attorneys from their end, and the politicians from their end. Gary was coming from the world, you know, he could put it all together.
He had a unique position, for sure. You know,
He did, yeah.
And he used it always to benefit other people.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He did, and he was always helping. I worked with him on a number of projects, and it was just amazing how he could get things done. And,
he kind of owned the room when he was in it, you know, and not from a pompous standpoint, but just he sort of had the control because people trusted him and they trusted what he said.
Yeah, he was a humble guy, and but it was a very good relationship we had, and I was trying to think of a time when we had a difference, a real difference, and I can't do it.
Can't think of one.
Forgot
Okay.
it, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
And we just
well, if you can't remember it, you didn't have too many of those. Because often those are the things we do remember.
Yeah,
so.
always seemed to be able to work things out.
Yeah. Well, and I think that was kind of his forte within the city of Fergus Falls. And with the people that he went to, like you, Carrie, individually, and said, hey, I think I could see you doing something like this. I bet he went to people with ideas that they hadn't even thought of.
Oh.
And they were thinking, well, maybe if Gary is behind me and he thinks I can do that, maybe I'll do that. Did you see that happen?
Well, yes, it was awful hard to tell him no.
Yeah.
And he did. He had a genuine interest in people, and he wanted everybody to succeed, you know. And he worked pretty hard to get that done.
And, you know, he had his own business to worry about and owned the, you know, and to look at Fergus Falls and how that would affect what he did professionally. But he always had to see, he seemed like he always had a lot of time for other people and their stuff, too.
He did.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know, Mary, I've got a quick story. You know, I know Mark before we get to Mark, but around that same time, so my connection and my family's connection to Gary goes back to 1980, when around the same time that John's talking about. But my grandfather and my father had sold their family business in Illinois, and my dad and my mother were looking at different communities that they were going to move to. And they had a franchise opportunity in a number of different communities. One was in Arizona, one was in Laverne, Minnesota. And they made the trip to Fergus Falls. And they met Gary Spies. He took them out to lunch. At that time, it was to Mabel Murphy's. And my dad, I was asking my dad the other day, and he said he still remembered that lunch. He still remembered what they ate. He remembered that Gary ordered ice cream cones for all of us kids, you know, me and my three sisters. And, you know, I think that, like many people, you know, so Gary was the first introduction that my family had to Fergus Falls. And after that lunch meeting, it was done. You know, my dad and mom didn't look at any other communities. They saw Fergus Falls. They saw this person, and that was their introduction, and the rest is history. And they said, this is the community we want to live in because of that one lunch meeting with Gary back in 1980.
And I bet there are countless numbers of people and families who could kind of reiterate that story, because that's the guy he was. Let's bring him to Fergus Falls. Mark, I'm going to have you grab that microphone, and let's get your take on all of this. I know that you seem to remember a lot of the things that Gary used to say, and boy, he had some. I feel like they should be written down and published, because there's some good thoughts. If all of us could hang on to some of those things, this world would be a different place.
I'm just interested as I'm listening to each person talk. Gary was one of the first people that I really knew that was a master of the Socratic way. And Gary would right now, he says, stop that, don't say those kinds of things. What does that really mean? And what it was is that he had more knowledge to give through questions than any person that I ever knew. And what he would do when John was referring to everything got quiet, so many times what he would do, he would just keep going around the room and say, what do you think about that? Or, you know, I heard such and such. Then he would, in a question, he would give an answer. And then he would say, what do you think? And it was a really extraordinary way of being able to tap into just a whole lot of things, as well as building up confidence and doing all the rest of it. The story that I have to tell, I've told this story to a few people, but Gary never really wanted me to tell it. And he never said until I die, but I assume that's sort of where it went. But my life goes back to Gary, back into the early, probably the mid-'80s. It would probably be about 85, 86. And this was really before I was involved with Dolan Consultants or the Port Authority or Otter Tail Power or any of the rest of it. And I remember I had gotten myself involved in a lot of stuff. My brother and I were involved in too much stuff, which is still probably more than what I do. I still probably do that. But he called me down to his office, which was sort of had a Kafka-esque type. It was sort of looked like a dungeon. It was poured cement walls, and it had World War II era furniture. And he said, he says, Mark, this community needs you. Now, that was the first time that I'd ever really heard anybody say, Fergus Falls needs me. And all I could think about at that time was all the things I wasn't doing right. And he says, no, he says, we need this church, this community needs you. When Carrie and Ben and we're talking about this, it needs you. And it was an extraordinary thing to have the community all of a sudden have an entity that said, Fergus needs you. And then what he did was he knew that I was in financial trouble. And over the course of a conversation, he ended up going over to his filing cabinet. For those that remember, and you creak out this filing cabinet. And what he did was he wrote me out a check to help me in my financial situation. And what I think was so incredible about it, I said, so what are the terms and conditions of this loan? And he says, the terms and conditions of this loan will be discussed when you pay me back the principal. So 6 to 8 years later, I paid him back the principal. And I asked him at that time, I said, what do I owe you? He says, what you owe me is to do good in this community. And the rest of that story is because, everything is there. So probably 15 years ago, we were sitting talking about it, and he was sort of chuckling. And we were talking about it, and I was telling him how much I appreciate it. And I said, I never could figure out where you got that money, because you're right in the middle of doing so many things yourself. And he got real quiet, and he says, Mark, I didn't have the money. I had to go out and borrow the money that I borrowed to you.
Oh, my goodness.
And it's something, if Gary was here right now, he'd just absolutely be furious that I ever told this. But it was such an incredible story of giving. And it was such an incredible story of a person who would always say, give more than you receive. And what was incredible is, for most of us that sat around, he received an enormous amount. But of course, you never would know it. He came from the school of minimalism, and his whole idea is, he says, if it's reliable and it works, it's good enough. And for those of us that remember what he drives and how he dressed and all, you never knew that Gary had that kind of money and had that kind of position. He just was a master of the understatement. And he was a person who believed the greatest investment was in people. That was what and all of us are living examples of it. He would invest in people above everything else.
And it seems like it was so much more far-reaching than what each of you did in the community, your jobs. It was so far beyond that, because he was looking at you. He wanted you to succeed and be good for Fergus Falls, to succeed in your positions, but also to just be happy, succeed as a person. Yeah. And I know you have a million quotes from him.
I do. I'll tell you the one when Carrie talked about the Churchill quote. That was one, but he also had one from Maya Angelou that he would do, and he would give this out too. He says, "People will forget what you do, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And I think that's again what we hear here is people, how he made them feel, and he had an extraordinary ability to instill confidence. And to rebuild. He was an encourager. He was a hope builder. And even in the darkest of moments, he would say, so what are you going to learn about this? What do you think is here? So
I just think about the time that he took. All of us in our professional careers, and with families and basketball games and hockey games and all that kind of stuff, we know how busy life can be. And he never seemed like he was too busy to take that time out to make those one-on-one connections, that kind of floors me. I mean, it doesn't surprise me because I knew who Gary was. Gary was a friend of my dad's when he was on the city council and making decisions along with other councilmen for the city. But Gary always had a big impact on the city council and each of those people. I remember countless times when he would be sitting around our dining room table over a cup of coffee with my dad. And sometimes the conversations were intense, and I was probably 10 or 12 years old at the time. But I do remember Gary spending a lot of time sitting around our dining room table, and they would hash out things that were going on in Fergus Falls and what was best and how they could get that done. So he always had time for those one-on-ones, which is extraordinary. I mean, think about the last time. Sometimes we can't even find it in our schedules to call somebody and grab a cup of coffee or lunch. But he always had time to do that. Ben, let's talk a little bit about involvement with regard to the city and some of the things that you remember about Gary and his helpful ways moving the city of Fergus Falls forward.
Well, yeah, I think just listening to Carrie and John and Mark, I think, John talked about his wisdom, and I think Gary was incredibly community-minded, but he had this wisdom, and each of Carrie and Mark's stories about how he helped them individually, I think Gary, when I think back, and all the people, you talked about the time, and when we had the Cafe Toast down there, and Gary would come in every day, and he was meeting with just countless people every day. He would have the time to meet with them, but he saw, I think, the bigger picture that a community is strong when the people are strong, right? So he saw that Carrie was a part of this community, and for her to be successful and for Mark to be successful back in the mid-'80s, that would strengthen the community. And I know personally, when Tessa and I started Union Pizza and Brewing Company. Of course, Gary was the first one I went to get his advice at the time. Had a business plan, had a financial structure, had a location, had all these things. And I just simply said, hey, Gary, I presented this thick document to him as if he was going to read it, right? And I said, what do you think? And he said, well, he took the document, set it to the side. He said, I think your idea is a good one. I think it's going to be successful. I think that the way you're going to finance it, well, we can talk about that. He said, but your location. He goes, we've got, that's not the right location. And he saw the big picture, right? It was the wisdom. He saw the big picture of where it should be and how that would tie into, at the time, Cafe 116, which was next door. And he just had this way of seeing the big picture and then how each individual had worth and would contribute to the bigger, larger sense of community. And he took the time. And so, I just remember he didn't, it wasn't a financial support at that time that he was providing. It was just kind of that he did talk to the people that needed to be talked to, like, hey, this is a good idea, we're going to support, and this is the way that this thing's going to fit together, like he did in so many different ways. And I thought, boy, how lucky I was to have, him in my corner during that, really important time in my life, in our life, and for our family. But he saw it. Not only was he helping me, but he saw the bigger picture. He saw how that was going to benefit maybe another individual that needed employment in a business and how they tied together. So he had that wisdom and the big picture, but it never got away from the individuals and how he would support and help those individuals. So that's just hearing these stories this morning just kind of just reinforces in me that bigger picture that Gary saw and how much better this community is in so many different ways, so many untold stories.
I just want to, when you just triggered something that I thought about, but somebody once says, normal people run from fires. Gary ran to the fires. Because what was interesting is that every time there was a disruption, every time there was a problem, most people would run for cover. Gary would say, here's an opportunity. And that I watched it over and over and over again when everybody would go, all is lost, and Gary would step up and say, I don't think so. What do you think? And then away we would go. I don't know, you're waving, you're nodding your head, Carrie. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, I keep thinking of architect, like a community architect, because I'm also thinking of a story when he said years after the Perkins, the college needs you, the community needs you, and you're going to be here the rest of your life, and we need you to step into that role. He also then, years later, said, now the hospital needs you, so you need to be on the hospital board. And so I think about the connections he made between us as leaders to make us be the drivers of that change. I think of legacy, I mean, that it's really setting things up for the future, and the connections we've made as a community and as individual people were really orchestrated by Gary in a lot of ways. So he set people up for success, and then he set them up to meet other people who would be successul, so that together we could do great things for the community. And that's remarkable.
Trickle down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. It's just so many ways that he impacted so many things. I often think of, sometimes I think, man, I've got a great idea. And instead of thinking it through or talking it over with Gary Spies, I would probably likely just charge ahead. And then you'd come up against a handful of things. Oh, gosh, never thought of that. Ooh, boy, never thought of that. Gary was not that guy. He had already thought of that. You're nodding your head, John.
Well, yes, he certainly would have. And he had this reservoir of respect, that he could deal with, and just about everybody in town owed him a favor. So he could...
Did he ever call them in, I wonder?
Yes, he did.
Did he? Well, he was so busy giving them out, I wondered if he ever called them in.
Yeah, but he would use them to help in another situation.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was certainly one of the strengths. And, he was just, in terms of wisdom and common sense and benevolence, the man was unmatched. There was just nobody even close.
Yeah.
And he would use those and all the other things he had at his disposal to help people and to work through things. I think one of the things that I haven't heard mentioned was courage, and he had a lot of courage, to do what he did and to help people like he did, and he believed in them, and he believed in their potentials, and I think we've talked about that before, that he wanted everybody to be better, and he would make people better. They would do things that they really didn't think they were capable of.
Well, I think the encouragement to just try something. I mean, I think a lot of people, and Carrie, you might be one of them, that thought, I don't know if I want to do that. But he was the encourager, and now that you look back, you think, wow. Without him, you may not have taken that step.
But he would walk with you, those steps too.
But again, where did he find that time? Man, if we could get a little bit of his time management, I could use a little of that, Gary, time management.
He would always say, we all have the same number of hours in the day.
Yeah.
Like that was a big thing to him, and how you use that. He would always, if I would ask, Gary, I'm thinking about doing this, or Tess and I are thinking about doing this, he'd say, well, you have 24 hours in the day. How are you going to use them? He would his time management was pretty remarkable.
Yeah,
he was a remarkable person in that stewardship wasn't a saying. It was just a way of life. But it was interesting. I think first and foremost, he would always come in and he would talk about faith, family, friends, and community, and it was usually in that order. But what was interesting is for him, I really was not that familiar growing up Lutheran from the Catholic perspective, but when I started to listen to him, if somebody would wanted to know what his faith was, read about what a Franciscan was. And it was the first time I'd actually seen this come to light, where the whole issue of charity and humility and building people together, and he did it in such an incredible way, no one was offended by it. He just did it. There was a togetherness about him, a wholeness that it wasn't like, well, I'm going to act one way here and one way. He was always the same guy. And I think probably one of the most extraordinary things, and I'll use these names, because I don't think I'm overstepping the bounds, but if I am, my apologies to the people I'm doing. But when he was on the board, him and Mark Olson were very close friends. And we tend to forget that Mark ends up going to be in the Federal Reserve and all the rest of it. And when he would come back, I'd sit and talk with Mark, and he would talk about all the other stuff, and then he would say, but Gary was my friend. And he was sort of this quiet, Gary was my friend. Here was this but he was my friend. And I know that Ken Nelson and I talked about this as KLN. He says, Gary's my friend. And it's sort of like the ultimate statement of which from all things flow. Because you knew whether it was stewardship or whether it was faithfulness or whether it was the person that was always there to help you, whatever, it would all be just down to one thing. He's my friend.
Yeah, interesting that you bring up Ken Nelson, because, he has sort of done some of those things for his community as well. And I love to hear that they were friends. And I'm sure there were a lot of collaborative moments as well.
Yeah, Ken and Gary were good friends. Gary lived in Perham for a while. He had the store up there.
Yep.
And he and Kenny developed quite a friendship, and they're still friends. And Gary is on Kenny's board.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Well, I'm sure they traded lots of stories too,
Oh,
and had a lot of good ideas for each other. Though, I mean, they had sort of the same mindset about their particular communities and how to make the community better by making the people better, or maybe bringing out in the people all that they had to give.
I think so. And Kenny really has done an awful lot for Perham.
He sure has.
And Gary's done a lot for Ferguson. They're wonderful examples. And it's fun to watch Gary get something done. And, if he decides it's got to be done, he'll find a group of like-minded people and just go do it.
Did he ever come up with an idea where you thought, well, this'll never happen, and it did? I mean, did you ever have doubts in Gary?
Not really.
No.
But he didn't like meetings. He wanted to stay behind the scenes. He was a humble guy, and that's the way he operated.
All the things that he did for the community, whether it's the cancer center, the community arena, the improvements to the facilities at the high school, the college, the library that he was behind with his resources, and he brought other people in, obviously, to make those things happen. I remember when we were talking through dedicating the Spies Riverfront Pavilion to he and Sharon and their family, and how we were going to do that, because he did want to stay behind the scenes, and how are we going to get this done without Gary putting a stop to it. And so that was a trick to get that through without Gary putting a stop to it.
He was just a little too humble for that.
So I remember how we did that. We had a State of the City address, and we had some special guests, and it was kind of a big thing. And I had to give a speech that night, and so I remember Tessa said to him, she said, Tessa said, Gary, I'm really, really nervous about this. Will you sit with me during this speech, because I'm really nervous, and Ben has to be up there. And anyway, so he was sitting in the front row thinking that he was supporting Tessa during this moment. And then when we sprung it on that we were going to name this Riverfront Park, that was one of my favorite moments with Gary, because he got that was typical Gary. He didn't want the spotlight. And then if you look at the words down at the Riverfront Pavilion, it's dedicated in the spirit of Gary and Sharon Spies to the people of Fergus Falls for what he brought to the community. So it wasn't a recognition of dollars. It wasn't a recognition of accomplishments. It was a recognition of the spirit that he and Sharon and their family brought to Fergus. And I'm glad we were able to do that for him.
Yeah, I'm just so glad that you were able to get that done so that he could be there and he could see it. And over the last couple of years, he's seen, I'm sure he has seen a lot of benefit, as everyone else has, about the way that it has been used and what it did for downtown Fergus Falls. And his family will long be able to take a look at that going forward, too, and see all the differences that will make. And there will be a lot of smiles and a lot of remembrances saying, boy, Gary would have loved this. Or I bet we're going to hear that over and over and over again about Spies Riverfront Park.
That's as good as it gets, Gary would say.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't matter if it was the biggest thing in the world or just something neat that happened to that was neat, he'd say, but something that happened to one of your kids at school. And he would say, that's as good as it gets.
Oh.
He would, I think somebody this came on up here, but without Sharon, there wouldn't have been a Gary. And, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I think they were about 15 when they started going together, or 16.
Love to hear those.
It was something like that. I mean,
he was over at George. He was over at
Ferguson.
Ferguson. Sharon's dad's house, working on something on the roof.
Sherman Ferguson.
He's a well driller, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do believe, and there's going to be people that will always remember Gary, but I do get concerned that we also have still the opportunity to thank Sharon, because you realize all this time that he was with whoever on whatever, he wasn't at home. Right. And yet you never heard a complaint from Sharon on that, as far as I never did. So.
Well, and the thing about Sharon, he was just, he would say, and he would talk about her father and her, Sharon, that they were the happiest people in the world. He just loved that. He would just beam when he would just talk about how happy Sharon was, and she just was happy. And that just talks a lot about, I think, what Gary valued in life, that it was just that people were happy and helping others, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I remember Sherman Ferguson, that name around my house a lot too. So my dad was buddies with Sherman along the way, and so there feels like a real connection. And I certainly I am not alone. There are so many people who have that same connection going forward. And friendship was such an important thing to him. And Mark, you mentioned, but he's my friend. And Carrie, I bet, I mean, he helped you with your career, but there was a friendship there too.
Absolutely. And checking in on my kids and my family and our commitment to Fergus Falls, continued commitment to Fergus Falls. I mean, he cared deeply. And I said, too, I mean, I've say a lot that our job at the college is to believe in people before they believe in themselves, and really learned that from Gary, from leading in that way, pushing people outside of their comfort zone, drawing the line in the sand sometimes, but mostly helping them see that it's their idea, their potential. And so he never doubted that he cared about me and that he cared about my family and everything that happened to us. And that, I just hope that as a community we can continue to lead in that way, because it's the most genuine way to approach Christianity and community building. And I think we've gotten pretty far away from that sometimes. And Gary just kind of brought that back in every person that he saw, just saw their goodness.
Yeah. John, I know that you, it started with that lunch where you thought the other shoe was going to drop. That made me smile. But I bet there was a friendship that was forged pretty quickly too.
Oh yes, there was. There were more lunches, and we've been together a lot over the years. And he was a wonderful friend.
Yeah.
He anticipated things, I think, and he was always there to help, and if there was.
I wish that each of us around this table and everybody listening this morning could take, even if you didn't know Gary, hopefully there's one thing you take away from all the things that the four of you have said today, because it truly would make a difference in people's lives and this community and around the world. As you mentioned, Carrie, things have gotten to a point where they're a lot different today than they used to be. And some of these things feel like such grounding kinds of ideas.
I've often thought how many fewer problems there'd be in the world if everybody conducted themselves just a little bit more like Gary, because he could bridge about any situation and get it done. You
have mentioned humbleness a number of times, and I think that probably describes him as well as anything.
Mm-hmm.
I just also want to have the opportunity here, when you speak of humbleness and all the rest of it, there's this great line, I think it was Nicholson that said it, and my apologies, I'm going to take a little bit of it, but to know Gary was to have somebody that wanted to that you wanted to be a better person. And I think what Gary did was he leveraged all these relationships. And as we sit here, we can sort of forget now that just a couple weeks ago, Bruce Thome died and Gary died. But what I want people to know is what an incredible opportunity it was to have a trio of people, of Bruce and Gary and John. And I watched how those three guys made each other better, and how they leveraged stuff, and how they made the community better and the businesses better. And I watched friendship work in a way that was really extraordinary. And John will never say that, and you're probably going to be mad at me now, John.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, even just that is an absolute exhibit A. This relationship on how three guys made each other better, and in turn the community and Otter Tail and whatever else you want to work through. And I'm sorry, John, if I shouldn't have said that. But it's sort of there.
Mark, it's too late. No, I agree totally. I do wonder if this was a guy who ever slept at night, because he had to be having these things go through his head all the time about, oh, how do I get Carrie to accept this position? How do I get Ben to open that business? How can I encourage so and so on the hospital board to continue? Or, I mean, so many things. How did the guy ever sleep, do you think?
I remember even when he would go on vacation. So he and Sharon would go down to Florida for a bit back about 10 years ago. And so when we were starting our business in March of 2015, there's a lot of things that go into it, and I was probably, Tess and I were stressed out, and I remember a phone call I got from Gary from Florida. So even when he was on vacation, he said, we were facing an issue of whether we were going to open the next week or whatever, and he said, if this business is going to be successful, it's going to be successful for years, not weeks. So don't worry about these next couple days. And then he said, I have 100% confidence in you. Just do what you think is right. You're going to make this work. And for me, he knew that's what I needed to hear at that time. And for him to, I think Carrie and Mark and probably John at different times in our lives, in our relationship with Gary, Gary Spies having confidence in you was all you needed in this life.
And I just got a text, and I hope this is okay, Mickey. And if it isn't, oh well. Mickey Rohde just sent me a photo of the never give up sign. And he said, I too got one of those. And on the back of it, Mickey has a card written, given to me by Gary Spies after having breakfast with him on the 13th of January, 2015. So thanks, Mickey, for sending that.
I went into my daughter Beatrice's room this morning to wake her up. She's 18. She's a senior in high school, and that same plaque is sitting on her dresser in her. There's a lot of those never give up around town.
I think they ordered too many at the market.
Or they just kept ordering.
That's great. Isn't it fun to hear all the lives touched in so many areas, too, and it's great to remember him and have these smiles and these great stories. And boy, I would guess over the course of the day especially, but for weeks and months and years to come, people will be telling these stories about Fergus Falls, how we got here, and what a legacy he left. And I'm sure, boy, so much pride for his family and what that meant to Fergus Falls. What do you think it's going to mean going forward? How will people remember this and just think, we got to keep this rolling?
Well, I think his legacy will live on, in the lives he touched and the things he was involved in. But how are we going to replace him?
Yeah, well, that I don't know that that's a possibility. But
I don't know that it is either, but it'd sure be nice if we could.
One of the things that we didn't talk about today, and it's one of the things that struck me most about Gary, and that was his willingness to hire a lot of different people with a lot of different aptitudes, perhaps. Maybe some that maybe weren't the best employees or the ones that got the most done. But you know what? He wanted to give them jobs, and he encouraged all of those people that worked for him, just like he did each and every one of you.
I remember a time, Mary, where I was having a conversation with someone that was having some troubles in their life. Gary walked into the restaurant at the time, and the three of us talked. And this person was going through a tough time, someone that probably a lot of us would have a tendency to write off. And anyway, that person left, and Gary looked at me and he said, God gives us an opportunity every day to be better people. And that's the way he looked at those situations that you're talking about. He helped so many people that other people would write off, and he looked at it as part of being a human being and caring for his fellow human beings. So again, all the resources and all of the wisdom, but that time and that compassion that he gave to others in so many different ways, like you said, Mary, is what I will remember most about Gary.
What I remember is service food being downtown now where the market is, and that being service food. That's, and Mark, I think you can recall that with me, right? That was our grocery store. That's where we went. And everyone knew Gary because of service food. And, it was just, it was iconic. And Ben, you know how I love Fergus Falls iconic stuff and how they didn't turn the Christmas lights on till Thanksgiving night and all those things I remember. And my dad was on the fire department and they'd put up all the decorations, but they never turned them on until Thanksgiving night. And I thought that is so cool because I'm the Christmas light police.
Yes.
So, yeah.
There's a logistical lesson there too. So
Yeah.
Gary, the service food was in the market there. He'd tell me this story when he was just telling me whether or not something can get done. He said, we turned the lights off Friday night at the market and we opened service food Monday morning. He said, if there's enough time, people, and energy and a willingness to get something done, we can get that done. So he would always tell me that story, how they moved from the market to the current service food. He was just he just had that mindset that anything was possible if you put your mind to it.
Isn't it? Don't we all just want a little piece of that that forethought? And he seemed to be able to. I don't know if he had a crystal ball or whatever it was, but he was able to look down the road and make the right decisions for Fergus Falls, for his friends, for his colleagues, and that, I think, was probably what he'll be remembered for. Well, I wondered, I set aside the whole show, the whole hour, thinking we might need part of the second half, but here we are, done. So an hour can go by pretty quickly when you're remembering a friend and just an iconic businessman, just all-around great guy. So maybe we leave this show by saying never, never, never give up, right? As in the words of Gary Spies. We hope you have enjoyed this tribute. Thanks to each one of you for coming in, and so much fun to hear all these stories. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, it was great to have you all in. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, Dave, that will wrap things up. And again, the funeral is at 1 o'clock today at First Lutheran. Visitation from 10 until 1. And if you go to the Olson Funeral Home website, there is a link for you to click there to live stream if you're unable to attend in person. So that will wrap up our show. Thank you for joining us.